And we're starting with probably I shouldn't say the most well-known, because John Cougar Mellencamp sold a metric shit ton of albums as well. But this is the Red Hot Chili Peppers. We'll do a very brief bio for all of these artists, albeit probably bigger ones for the other three artists who we will not be covering. I believe we're currently scheduled to, in terms of our show running, cover 4 Chili Peppers albums down the road. I know we have Blood Sugar Sex Magic, we have Californication, I believe we have By the Way, and I think we have Stadium Arcadium are all there. So pretty much a run of 4 out of 5 albums. I think we're missing One Hot Minute, which ironically is an album I really like quite a bit, and I know Matt does as well. But so this one is the Chili. What album do you think this is for the Chili Peppers, guys? Are you familiar with where it would be in terms of the run?
I think I read. Oh, okay. I read that it's their 3rd, right?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Well, then
it is their 4th album, believe it or not. This one follows the self-titled debut from 1984, which it's freaking amazing to think the Chili Peppers were releasing albums in 1984. Freaky Styley came out in 1985. The Uplift Mofo Party Plan, something that sounds like it was named by Matt, from 1987, and then Mother's Milk from 1989. In case you were wondering sort of the concept of Mother's Milk, you can take a look at the cover of a shirtless woman with a variety of pictures of the bands looking up to her. Anthony Kiedis is sort of looking up lovingly while situated over her right breast. I think Flea is splayed out on her arm, looking dead. I think we've got John Frusciante just grinding away in the middle of her breasts. And then we have, I think at this point it's still, it was Chad Smith, I think, had just joined the band. In fact, it is. And he's looking upwards as well, but more sort of assertively, I think, than Anthony Kiedis, which I would say is more whimsically. Any thoughts on the cover, guys?
It's attractive. I mean, it's gonna sell some albums and get some attention, that's for sure. And I feel like it is in the theme of the album and kind of what their vibe is, for sure.
I really like the album cover, just not so much just obviously as a cisgendered male. It was attractive.
God. So you're bringing cisgendered into the podcast.
However, in terms of just album artwork, I thought it was pretty good and original. In terms of is very on brand for what we know of the Chili Peppers.
Yeah, I agree. I also like the coloring, kind of like the black and white. It's kind of faded out, and then they got this pops of color in it. I think that draws your eye too.
Absolutely. So let's do a thumbnail sketch here of the Chili Peppers. So Chili Peppers, 3 of the original members of the Chili Peppers. 3 school friends, Anthony Kiedis, the lead singer, who is still in the band then, now, forever, in terms of that. Hillel Slovak, who unfortunately was the guitar player who actually he died. He passed away shortly before this album, but he was their primary guitar player. He also was a very good trumpet player. And then Michael Balzari, he's Flea. But he, much like Slovak, was considered to be a very talented musician in his high school days. Anthony Kiedis was not known as a musician necessarily. He was a poetry writer and an actor during his high school time. Kind of the origin story of the band is that Hillel Slovak teaches Balzari how to play bass, and the duo encourages Anthony Kiedis to start putting sort of music, the music they're writing, to his poetry, which he does. They're listening to all the things you would imagine, Sly Stone, Parliament Funkadelic on the funk end, right? And then the punk end is going to be Black Flag, X, The Germs, the Minutemen. 3 of those 4 we've covered in albums here. And they decide to bring in the drummer Jack Irons, who is in the band and is also gone shortly before this album, replaced by Chad Smith. If I remember correctly, and if there's a person to have on this podcast, it is Sam, noted Pearl Jam enthusiast. Am I correct, Sam, in that Jack Irons was in Pearl Jam as well at one point?
Yeah, he did. He served as the replacement of the replacement drummer, I think. They've had like 4 or 5 drummers, right?
Yeah.
So their first drummer left right after recording 10. Okay. Then they brought in Abruzzi, replaced Abruzzi with Irons. Irons left, I think it was due to health issues.
Okay.
And then they brought in, I think there might have been one more before they brought in Cameron from Soundgarden.
Yeah. Anyway, way long story short, they begin to record. They've got this group together. They get a record deal eventually. They're gigging pretty much nonstop throughout the 80s. They get replacement members because at one point Slovak and Irons both left the band shortly before their debut album, but then they both end up coming back to the band, and that's where Freaky Styley comes in. So really, this version of the band, right, the Kiedis, Flea, Hillel Slovak, Jack Irons band did Freaky Styley and did the Uplift Mofo Party Plan. And they're starting to get a little bit of traction on the alternative charts, a little bit of traction in sort of the alternative press. And then unfortunately, Slovak dies of a heroin overdose on June 25th, 1988, which profoundly affects the band, not just now, but in future albums, and leads to a bunch of songs and sort of a variety of things. If you see the members interviewed, they talk about it. But after Slovak dies, Irons leaves again, and Kiedis and Flea sort of decide we're going to go ahead and keep the band going, even though Kiedis himself is in that weird spot where he's battling a major heroin addiction as well, while also mourning. They bring in former Parliament guitarist Blackbird McKnight, and actually this one's going to be familiar to you, Josh, former Dead Kennedys drummer D.H. Peligro.
Right.
But it does not work out, and they instead end up getting John Frusciante and Chad Smith. If I remember correctly, John Frusciante was kind of like a fan of the band and ends up joining a band that he liked as well, which is something that happens a surprisingly large amount in 1980s and 90s bands. I always think of, like, Adrian Young was a super fan of No Doubt before joining the band as their drummer and stuff like that. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure Robert Trujillo, same thing with Metallica.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
And stuff like that. Yeah. So anyway, that is sort of the origin story going up to here. And this album, I feel like I've talked a little bit more than I planned on, but this is the album that, while not their breakthrough, that would be Blood Sugar Sex Magic, right? The one that sort of catapults them into the stratosphere.
Yeah.
This, though, is the one where they begin to get MTV play. They got a deal with Warner Brothers off of this, and this is the beginning of probably the Chili Peppers as most people remember them in the sort of the late 80s, 90s version of it. Now, it's weird because Frusciante's in and out of the band, right, at different times, and replaced by different guitarists. I think 2 separate times he's in and out of the band. But this is sort of the version that plays on most of their most well-known stuff. I think Josh gets the first take.
Yep.
Initial impressions on Mother's Milk by the Chili Peppers. I know Sam said he was familiar with this album. I definitely was familiar with this album coming in. What was your level of familiarity?
Yeah, I was not familiar with this album. I knew the singles. I mean, I definitely heard those, Higher Ground and well, I guess Higher Ground is the only one I actually knew. And the yeah, that's the one I knew. And my kind of relationship with Red Hot Chili Peppers is always was of kind of, I wouldn't say disdain, because that's kind of a strong word, but I just never kind of got what they were about and was not really interested in exploring them. And I think it was because my main exposure to them was Californication and the singles, which played incessantly all the time. And
okay, so I think you became a Chili Peppers fan at the Californication, or like the 99 2000
well, I think
version.
that's just when I heard them. It's not like
aware of them.
Liked,
gotcha. Okay,
listening to them. So I think Scar Tissue played so much that I just started to hate them because I didn't really like that song that much. And I knew Under the Bridge, obviously, from the next album, but I just never. that album didn't impress me, or what I heard didn't impress me, so I never kind of went to find out what made them special. So not knowing this album and coming with that in mind, I really like this album. I thought it was great. This is my favorite Red Hot Chili Peppers album by default. It is it is kind of, I love the energy that they bring. I love how they incorporate the funk obviously into their rock music. They just seem kind of wild and explosive, and it also seems like they have this is also kind of based on my knowledge of Flea and some of the interviews he's given and stuff, but they seem to have a pretty deep knowledge of different styles of music and seem to be music fans in general. I get a lot of kind of like jazz vibes from this album, and in incorporating different things like the horns effectively on this, and just kind of even something like the homage to Fishbone that's right in the first track. We just covered that album, and then like I immediately heard it, and so it rung a bell. So if they're a fan of Fishbone and punk rock, and they're in that LA scene, with X and all those other bands that we talked about, then
I think they're more influenced than in the scene, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but still, they're fans of that music in some way, right? So
correct,
I think they're incorporating that into the this album. Even something like when they do that radio like dial switch in Good Time Boys, the opening track, it just made me think of Frank Zappa. So and I imagine Flea and them are interested, if not in Frank Zappa's music, then at least like what he brings in terms of that, like outsider aesthetic. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they also, they just kind of rock really hard on this too, and in their own kind of unique way, which I really liked. Flea's one of the more well-known bassists, I think, in the popular culture, and I love that the bass gets, it's kind of got equal sound to it in the mix, and I feel like I can pick out the bass lines pretty well in their music. And a lot of these tracks, not having heard them before, they really impressed me, and they were fun to move to, and I just kind of found myself shaking my head to a lot of them. I love the fact that they're crazy enough to make a song about Magic Johnson and the Lakers, which I found hilarious. And Kareem. There's multiple songs about the Lakers. Yeah. Yep. And the choruses are really catchy and fun to sing along to. I like their incorporation, like the album cover alludes to, they're not afraid to incorporate sex and innuendo into their song. Something like Stone Cold Bush, which is a pretty great song, but also hilarious at the same time. I don't think anyone's accused Anthony Kiedis of having too little interest in sex. Exactly, yeah. Or Sexy Mexican Maid, something like that. But all the way through, the songs are, there's a variety of kind of musical styles while still basing themselves in this funk rock, and but they all sound pretty different, and the album moves pretty well, and there's not really a weak song on here for me. Something like Taste the Pain, which is kind of in the middle of the album, was one of my favorite songs on here. I did not realize that Crazy Town took the instrumental for Pretty Little Ditty, so that makes me hate that band even more. Really? Yeah. They're covering Jimi Hendrix Fire on here. They're covering Stevie Wonder's Higher Ground, and that's another a way to recognize what they're indebted to. And they even put in Slash's guitar and Punk Rock Classic right at the end for Paradise City, and it's just a really enjoyable album, and I can see the talent, and I can see why they get popular, and now I'm really looking forward to Blood Sugar Sex Magic, because I really only know the singles off of that. So if this album is as good and as enjoyable as it was for me to listen to, then I can't imagine that is if that's better than this, then I'm gonna be a fan of the Chili Peppers, or at least this early stuff. So yeah, thumbs up for me for sure.
How about you, Sam?
I'm in agreement. There's not a whole lot that I can really add to what Josh was saying in terms of, the musical variety of sound, right? And it never once became too cacophonous where it just implodes on itself because of just there's too much going on. I think like Josh said with, that interpolation of Guns N' Roses into the end of, was it the punk rock classic, right? And then the way it was interesting in terms of the way they put Pretty Little Ditty, that instrumental piece, right near the end on the almost like on the flip side on the B side of a record, right? Like you flip it and then all of a sudden it's Fire, and then probably that or Stone Cold Bush Fire, then that third, Pretty Little Ditty as the third song on the flip side. So I thought it was a really neat mix of both, and in some ways it very much encapsulated the LA scene, right? Because you got some metal riffs in there, you have that hair metal rock element to it, you got the punk in there, you got the funk, you got what else is in there? There's just like you got elements of jazz in there too, not just because of the horns, but just because of the fusion elements of just the way the bass lines would riff into certain time signatures and the drums would keep up and then the guitar would go a different way. I thought that was a really neat kind of just the smorgasbord of the LA scene, the LA sounds at that time in the mid to late 80s there.
Yeah, and even the fact that, they're, like you said, they're willing to put an instrumental track in, which I don't think we've heard from any bands outside of the hip-hop that we've listened to up to this point, or maybe, earlier bands earlier in the decade. That's kind of been a rarity in the 80s, I think.
Well, prog rock also gave us some,
sure.
But these guys aren't really in that lane, I'd say.
Right.
So I'll give you my history with the Chili Peppers. So I first heard the Chili Peppers when I was in the year of 1988, when I was still in single digits as an individual. I heard them on I think it was in my friend's bedroom. His older brother, who was a good decade older than I was, he had a mixtape, and I vaguely remember something like a boombox. And I remember him playing it probably at ear-splitting levels. And, at this time I was in an interesting spot in my music life where anywhere between 50 to 70% of the music was mainstream sort of pop stuff was what I was listening to.
And Bobby
stuff
Brown.
Was, that Bobby Brown that I've talked about and different stuff like that. But then there's another lane where like slowly stuff is starting to come in. There was a Seton Hall College radio station that I became somewhat enamored with at first because I thought the names of the bands were really interesting. And then it was sort of like, I like the names of these bands, so let me listen to the music. And over time, exposure got me there. My dad and some uncles who were into music were sort of beginning to push me in certain directions. By accident on MTV, I was being exposed to stuff that was widening my palette. And then there was older brothers of my friends. And older brothers of my friends were integral in getting me to places like metal and punk and ska in particular, right? That was where I got a lot of it. But also, there was a lane of this one friend of mine's brother who loved Bad Religion, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Pennywise, Fishbone, like all that was the lane there. And I remember thinking how interesting this music was. And then I saw a picture of the Chili Peppers on a cover, and to an 8-year-old, right, you're like, these guys might be the coolest people in the world. Because when you're 8, you know what I mean? They just seem super cool in a weird way. They're like, it's like they're adults, but they're not. Like, well, what is, and remember in this era, the Chili Peppers still had, you were exposed to the Chili Peppers of 9900, Josh, when it's sort of like, we're going to consciously lose all of our edge, right? Like that's, and then, that continued along the way. Not to knock that version, but that Chili Peppers was, it's like, wait a second, the Red Hot Chili Peppers are an adult contemporary band, kind of. It was jarring, when you have a knowledge of this, and even, the 80s, 90s, I should say, Chili Peppers. This band was the one, it's like, do you know they wear socks on their dicks and, play, as fast as possible and probably are high all the time. And, it's just, they just
always
looked,
shirtless.
right. Yeah. They just looked, and Anthony Kiedis is like and Flea are like improbably ripped despite you can't figure out like what the deal is there. But yeah, they, so this band just visually had an appeal. And then, they're playing, there's this version of the Chili Peppers is such a definitive sound to me because each of the four guys, Anthony Kiedis, no one could ever confuse Anthony Kiedis with any other singer. He's very singular in terms of his style of singing. It's like rat-a-tat at times. It's spoken word at times. He, his over enunciation of some things and complete under enunciation of other things. His nonsense lyrics that are usually about sex and or temptation and drugs and giving in or not giving in. There's just a hedonism in everything. His visuals, his lyrics, like he just like is a walking hedonistic element, right? Flea is, I wouldn't say a singular bassist, but I guess Les Claypool from Primus is the only other guy I could think of who plays this style of bass, right? That drop down, bass where he just thunders to the front of the group, because at its core, the Chili Peppers are a funk band at this point, right? And funk is driven entirely by the bass, but he has a very easy to understand tone. John Frusciante, especially compared to the earlier Chili Pepper albums, you don't hear it as much on this album because he's getting buried in the mix a little bit, but certainly by Blood Sugar Sex Magic and, by the time you get him, Josh, in Californication, you can hear sort of that angular, almost like wah sound in his guitar tone that stands out. Now you hear it. I think probably you mentioned that guitar part that Crazy Town took, right?
Yeah.
But you hear like what that guitar tone is there. And if you listen carefully and can kind of push the bass and the drums to the back, because the bass and the drums in some ways dominate this album. You can begin to hear the beginning of John Frusciante's guitar tone. And then I would describe Chad Smith's drumming as hit the drums as hard and cymbals as hard as humanly possible. And then make your fills just rudimentary, like, like that's, you're not getting a lot of, I'm not going to say it's not bad drumming, but like it is just designed to be just a crashing, thudding sound, right? In the drums. In that way, it's also the drums always sound heavily produced compared to the rest of the instruments in its own weird way, which I consider to be something that you see in something like Metallica as well. Like Lars's drum sound kind of, I would say, is very similar in terms of how it's produced. So you've got all those pieces. And yet, like this version of the Chili Peppers, the 80s Chili Peppers, is probably, historically for me, and we're going to go through a lot of it, is probably my favorite Chili Peppers because they maintain the edge and the energy that's undeniable. It's almost like they said, here's this incredible live band and we're going to cover like what they do and synthesize it into an album. But unlike, jam bands or stuff that lose quite a bit in albums, right? It's remarkable how much they're able to maintain the enjoyment on an album as opposed to simply being a placeholder right before like the live albums, which is where you get the real experience, right? Like this almost feels like a bootleg that you would listen to, but it's also produced like a studio album, and normally that's a death sentence for a live band.
Was this pre-Rick Rubin Chili Peppers?
This is pre-Rick Rubin Chili Peppers.
Because Rubin comes in what? Blood Sugar, right?
Blood Sugar Sex Magic, yep.
And then he kind of molds their sound from there. This is that we're young, in our 20s, hungry, just full of virile and sex and drugs.
But this is not a stripped down album. This is a very produced album, which is very
it's a
different.
Very clean sound.
Yes.
Like you were saying. I wouldn't call the drums overproduced though. I would say the drums are very much that Chad Smith sound of hard snare hits and just like that's him.
I wouldn't say overproduced. I would say that they seem put in the mix in a way, that they're inserted into the mix, like in Whereas Flea always has an era of improvisation, right? And Anthony Kiedis always seems to have like an era of improvisation, even if he doesn't. And even Frusciante's guitar tone, right, weaving in and out. Like Chad Smith is a meat and potatoes drummer, you know, and I just feel like the sound at times is kicked into the mix so that it doesn't get lost with Flea's bass. I don't know if that makes sense, Sam, what I'm saying, but
No, it does, but in some ways it's also kind of, isn't it rudimentary of the funk sound, right? To have that loud drumming to kind of carry the sound forward from beginning to end with the bass kind of taking that center stage.
It's definitely the rhythm section, you're right, but I think in a lot of, and Josh, you can jump in too if you want, I think in a lot of the funk that we've covered, while you can do what Chad Smith does in certain songs, in the most part, the drums sort of function more like it did in jazz, right? Where occasionally it would intrude in, but largely it was keeping the time at certain things, or it was designed to back up the bass line, right? But the bass line sort of took the road, and the drums were almost like the backup singer on the rhythm section. Now the rhythm section was kicked up to the front, but the drums were the supporting part of the rhythm section. The bass just sort of overwhelmed, at least in some of the funk that I think we've covered so far. This has more of a feel of like metal drumming, you know, is how I would describe this, but not like thrash metal, more like traditional metal. So at least to my ears,
more aggressive maybe, or something.
I think so. Yeah.
I think it was kind of that 80s LA feel, right? Because you had that punk and rock and metal, and you just had all these sounds coming in and out of LA. Yeah. That's kind of, you know, them, isn't it?
Well, yeah, you don't hear a lot of like fills, like, you know, like Chad Smith loves to do that, you know, when he gets to a part, it's like, you know, you don't hear a lot of that in
but
funk.
Like this is early Chad Smith, right? Before he grows as a technical drummer. This is him kind of just drumming.
But on this album, he still has that like what I'm saying is from a funk album, right? You don't hear a lot of guys playing that you know, like I call it like a shotgun fill, right? Like that's not really an element of funk as much in terms of my understanding of the sound. Like I always think of it as more like, you know, you play around. It's almost like jazz, right? Where like the fill is much more like cascading, like, you know, and then it like, you know, like as opposed to like, you know, which I think of as more of like a metal sound, or even a punk fill, you know, at the end of something where they get to the thing and then it's like, and then they move on to the next. And I think that reflects a little bit of Chad Smith's influences, I think, too, because I don't think he's as moored into the funk sound like the rest of them, right? He does, I think, come from the metal world, if I remember correctly.
When you were exposed to this band, was this the first album of theirs you heard, or had you heard their earlier albums?
Are you talking to Sam or me?
Either one, actually.
I'll let you go first.
No, mine
Sam,
was Blood Sugar. That was the first, like that. It was that 91, 92 era of Pearl Jam and Blood Sugar and Nirvana and just that explosion of sound.
Yeah, that's like peak MTV too in some ways. I remember all those videos.
I think there was like a triple bill at one point, like of Beastie Boys as the headline, or Beastie Boys, Chili Peppers, and Pearl Jam as the opening act.
I think there was a triple bill on that.
Yeah, just amazing to have gone like with all the woes of Ticketmaster to realize like those tickets were probably like what, $20.
Yeah. I had a friend who went to go see whatever that triple bill was in. It was an older friend, so he would have been, you know, mid-teenage years. But yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about that along the way. But for me, Josh, to answer your question, the album I was listening to in my buddy's house was Freaky Styley. That was the album that I heard first. And so this was sort of presented to me as that album was out, right, in the ecosystem when I heard it. And this was sort of presented as, this is the new Chili Peppers album. But it was also presented to me as, oh, but it's a bummer because the guitarist died, man. And, you know, for a 9-year-old, you're not processing what that means, right, evolutionarily to the sound. But I could even tell then that this, I didn't have words for it, right, but I could tell that this album excited me more than Freaky Styley did. I liked Freaky Styley, but this album's like, oh, this is like an album I'd play more often, whereas the other album was like, this is a lot of sounds, and I like the sort of the feel of danger to it, but I don't know if it's an album like I would listen to like a pop album, right? You know, it's like, it didn't feel as if this was sort of like, it's like, oh, this is an album I could listen to like my cassette tapes of pop music, right? And it probably in many ways is a formative band in that thing. It's like, oh, like there's rock bands and bands that have that edge to them, but also they can sound like, I guess pretty would be the best way I could, you know what I'm saying? Like not like harsh. They can also sound appealing. So, and this is one of the first albums I think in my experience I found that was like, wow, this is a nice merge of the dangerous and the exciting and the aesthetically pleasing, to especially to like a palette of like a 8-9-year-old. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. It's kind of a step up in terms of complexity or just kind of more interesting types of music. Broadening the palette, I guess, would be a way to put it too.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Nice.
So I would definitely give this one a thumbs up. I enjoyed this quite a bit.
Yeah, same with me, for sure.
And any standout tracks, guys, that you would recommend to those that maybe haven't listened before?
Definitely the opening track, Good Time Boys. I feel like that's a good way to start off the album. And then I liked the double punch of Knock Me Down and Taste the Pain right in the middle. And I like Sexy Mexican Maid too. I mean, I really liked all of them, but those are kind of ones that I came back to upon further listens.
Yeah, Stone Cold Bush and Sexy Mexican Maid, which is funny because they're like, all the songs are to some degree overtly sexual, but those are the most, that is not specific. I think Anthony Kiedis' lyrics are hilariously ridiculous. Like they mean absolutely nothing in some ways, and as the 90s and 2000s go on, I think they get even more ridiculous as we go along. Here at least you're like, oh, this is just a funk band, the lyrics don't have to mean anything. But then later it's like clear that he's trying to make big statements, and I'm like, what in God's name is Anthony Kiedis like talking about? It's like, what's Jim Carroll? Is that the Basketball Diaries guy? It feels like he's like part Jim Carroll, part Jim Morrison as lyricist, part 60s beat poet Rod McEwen, part like Lord Byron, like, and like all these different like elements with sleazy like pop culture heavy metal lead, like Bret Michaels, right? Like he fuses all of these elements together, high and low brow taste into like whatever his lyrics are. But I think I would say, obviously the Higher Ground cover is epic. But yeah, I think I would say those two, Stone Cold Bush and Sexy Mexican Maid. I also like the variety in Pretty Little Ditty as well. It's almost like an experimental track, which I greatly appreciate. Sam, any tracks?
Wasn't Knock Me Down used in an anti-drug, like a say no to drugs, because of like the whole lyric line of if you see me get high, knock me down or something like that. Like I think I remember as a kid seeing, and that might have been my first exposure to the Chili Peppers, of seeing them with George Clinton in their video for that.
It would. I mean, if you isolate the vocal, it does sound relatively non-threatening. Like, if you see me, knock me down. It does sound a little bit, but yeah, it's. I mean, the idea of the Chili Peppers telling anyone to not do anything is hilarious.
I think like their agent might have gotten them wrong with, hey, I think we got this really good opportunity from the DARE campaign. Want to do it?
That's like right up there with Nixon, that picture of Nixon and Elvis Presley, right? Like where he's like bizarre to the youth about, and the 80s was a strange time for public appearance as opposed to like what was going on behind the scenes. So.
I thought the Magic Johnson track was really fun in terms of just musically, even though the lyrics were just like, I think there was maybe 10 to 12 words in the whole song. Mm-hmm. Punk rock classics, just really fun in terms of just the music and just the sound that they're kind of creating with punk, but also fused with their Chili Pepper style.
Right.
Right, and Magic Johnson, for record, is not the one where they literally go over every member of the Lakers roster, right? They're talking about like
No.
AC Green and like James Worthy. That is a separate track about the
No,
Lakers.
they
as
do
well.
have AC Green in there.
He does get mentioned, yeah.
Oh, he does. Okay, gotcha. Is that in Magic Johnson or is that a different track? I can't remember.
No,
There's
that's in
multiple
Magic
Lakers
Johnson.
ones. That's okay. I thought so. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, that track cracked me up because it was basically seems like they were watching a Lakers game and they're like, "How about we write a song about this?" Like, oh man, Michael Cooper could play defense. Let's throw him into the track. So, yeah. But it sounds like across the board, thumbs up.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
There we go. Okay. Well, that takes us one, and we're gonna say we don't even need to say this, I don't think, because we